Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward. Skeena-Bulkley Valley riding in northern BC has one of the highest percentage of Indigenous voters in the province. There are currently no Indigenous candidates, and that's leaving some voters feeling disconnected. APTN's Lee Wilson reports.
Skeena-Bulkley Valley is home to 89,000 residents, and the riding covers most of northern BC, from Hattagawai along the Alaskan Panhandle, making it geographically one of the largest ridings in Canada. 1/3 of the voters are Indigenous, but there is no Indigenous candidate in the riding, with the highest percentage of Indigenous voters in BC. And while 6 candidates held a debate at a forum in Houston, Robert Campbell, a hereditary chief from Kispiox, says community feels disconnected and not represented by the federal government.
Each candidate gets elected and we don't see them that much. And we always ask the government, why don't you guys come up here and see how we live? They make all these promises and they get elected and they neglect.
However, hereditary chief Campbell says there are serious issues in this election, especially the importance of employment.
Unemployment is high, and there's no, after the sawmill shut down, there's hardly any industry besides mining, and that's, you have to go away to different areas of BC.
Jobs in northern BC have been dependent on the natural resources and construction. One of the issues brought up at the forum was the 670-kilometer LNG pipeline, which spans across the north. That pipeline has faced strong opposition from the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. Richard White, Luk'adziwitz, spokesperson in Gitxsan, stressed Aboriginal title and land.
And a perfect example is with the Wet'suwet'en, where Coastal GasLink signed off an agreement with the imposed Indian Act band, who has a limited jurisdiction, and the pipeline doesn't go anywhere near the reserve land.
For Frankie Abel in Gitxsan, murdered and missing Indigenous women are her big concern. Her community is located along the Highway of Tears, where an estimated 40 people have gone missing or were victims of homicide.
The issues that come up for me is the Highway of Tears and missing murdered Indigenous women and other people who went missing on our highway. Housing is a big issue in my community, and employment.
Abel would also like to see housing addressed in their community, where homes are either overcrowded or not funded enough to be up to date.
Have homes that have sometimes up to 9 people in them. Children, aunties, uncles, grandmothers, grandparents, and that's a fire hazard.
Abel says more needs to be done to help families with missing members. Richard White believes that there is a long way to go before people here become more involved in federal politics. He says while the federal government might say that they support the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People, they fall short in recognizing the hereditary forms of governance over the land.
When they talk about reconciliation and implementing UNDRIP, they're falling very short of the mark.
Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Northern British Columbia.
With just days to go before the federal election, voters in a Mammoth Quebec riding won't have the option of ticking off Romeo Saganash's name on a box for a 3rd term. Earlier this year, Saganash announced he wouldn't seek re-election, but Indigenous women in Abitibi are taking up the political torch. Lindsay Richardson has more.
This time, 8 years ago, NDP candidate Romeo Saganash, Cree from Waswanipi, made history as the first Indigenous MP to be elected in Quebec, contributing to La Vague Orange, the Orange Wave, and overturning a former Bloc Québécois stronghold. Now, his decision to not seek re-election leaves a large portfolio and even larger riding to his party's successor.
Né d'un père québécois et d'une mère ojibwe, qui ont mis en valeur l'apprentissage sur le terrain et l'entrepreneur.
Jacqueline Rouleau, a Quebecois Ojibwe woman, is one of 7 candidates on the ballot, vying to represent the Abitibi, Bay James, Nunavik EU riding. Enveloping more than half of Quebec's total landmass, it is the largest riding in a Canadian province. And with dozens of First Nations and Inuit communities on the territory, its needs are as diverse as its population.
La vision du NPD est celle du gouvernement qui travaille pour les gens ordinaires. Pour les travailleurs et les travailleuses, c'est aussi ma vision. Je suis de la région et travaille avec les gens de la région.
Protecting waterways and fixing housing inequities are among her priorities, ones echoed by the riding's only other Indigenous candidate, Kiara Cabana-Whiteley, an Inuk teen from Kuujjuaq who's running for the Greens. Cabana-Whiteley lists healthcare, Indigenous women's rights, education, and climate action as her campaign priorities. Rouleau, however, says she aspires to further Saganash's work, but the goal of having UNDRIP adopted into Canadian law still causes friction with the Conservative Party. As favour for the Tories continues to grow in Quebec, Martin Ferron says he wants to see better access to nutrition in the riding's northern communities.
Pour les Premières Nations, au niveau de l'alimentation dans le Nord, on paye une boîte de macaroni $12 à Kuujjuaq. C'est inacceptable. Ça naît de la discrimination, ça, quand on n'est pas capable de donner accès à un peuple, à de l'alimentation saine, à un coût juste.
While the Liberal Party promises more investments if kept in power.
Nous sommes conscients que nous ne pouvons pas régler des siècles d'injustice en quelques années, mais nous sommes convaincus que les grands pas qu'on a fait depuis 4 ans ont jeté des bases solides d'une collaboration à long terme.
In the spirit of collaboration, most candidates agree on the need to bolster Indigenous votes. During the last election, just over half of Abitibi's eligible voters actually turned out. With only days until voting time, it remains to be seen whether the orange wave of 2011 and 2015 will persist for a 3rd term, and this time with a woman at the helm. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Val-d'Or.
Now for a look at another riding in BC where a high-profile Indigenous candidate is running for re-election. But as APTN's Tina House explains, it's going to be a battle till the end amongst all the parties.
Member of Parliament for Vancouver-Granville, Jody Wilson-Raybould, is running for re-election. Today, she's busy at her campaign headquarters, except this time, she's running not as a Liberal, but as an independent.
Door knocking at 11 until probably 1:30, then I have that lunch meeting.
And so far, she says she and her team have probably knocked on nearly 50,000 doors in the Vancouver-Granville riding, including Ted Cragg, who's volunteered here since January of 2015 and devotes 20 hours every week.
Met her in a coffee shop, and we just thought we were going to go and meet this lady because my wife said, I think she's sort of interesting. And we just fell in love with her right away. We were out door knocking within 15 minutes.
The Vancouver-Granville riding is an area of Vancouver that's filled with many affluent homes and situated near Granville Street, which is the main route to downtown Vancouver from the airport. Although she admits there aren't a lot of Indigenous people in this riding, she says that she can still do a lot of good for not only the constituents, but also Indigenous peoples in Canada.
What do I hope to accomplish for Indigenous peoples? Well, I ran for many reasons back in 2015, and one of those was to create the space for Indigenous peoples to be self-determining within this country. And that is going to require a significant amount of work in terms of deconstructing all of the colonial laws, including the Indian Act.
And not us.
Tonight is an all-candidates town hall, where candidates got to address some of the constituents about how they plan on representing them in Ottawa if elected. Taleem Nur Mohamed is running for the Liberal Party of Canada.
That means advocating on behalf of the constituents of Vancouver-Granville on matters of housing, ensuring that the housing strategy that was put in place sees benefits here in Vancouver-Granville.
Zach Siegel is running for the Conservative Party.
We need leadership that can bring all folks to the table at once. This is so important because the sake of our country rests on this.
Louise Bottin is running for the Green Party.
So what the Green Party wants to do is to implement a guaranteed livable income. Right now, the cost of living in this province is about, or especially in Vancouver, is about $22 an hour. That's the living wage. That's what we need to be able to survive in Vancouver or Greater Vancouver.
Naomi Chosick is the People's Party of Canada candidate.
We want to help you to help yourself, to stop taking your taxes away. We want to reduce the tax structure to 2 classifications from 5. We want to end supply management on dairy, milk, or on dairy, on eggs and poultry, because that is a tax on the poor that's benefiting the rich.
Yvonne Hansen is running for the NDP.
First of all, the jobs training program to retrain 300,000 people whose livelihoods currently depend on the fossil fuel industry. We need to be completely rebuilding the way that we interface with this country.
Next, it was Jody Wilson-Raybould's turn.
I will continue to be a loud and strong voice that represents the constituents of this riding directly on the issues that matter most. And what I've learned, and I am proud to come from an Indigenous culture that understands the nature of community.
No matter what happens, the support for this election has been overwhelming, and even the younger future voters are having a say. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Indigenous leaders are upset after Saskatchewan RCMP decided not to charge a man with trespassing on Ochapowace First Nation reserve land. The incident occurred last April, and now many are questioning why First Nations jurisdiction is not being respected by the RCMP. CTV's Creason Ashkate reports.
Fence this up. Look, it's got a fence.
For the past 9 years, Kenneth Bear has been managing farmland for Ochapowace First Nation. He supervises up to 20 families who rent farmland from the First Nation. Earlier this year, he says one relationship started to deteriorate.
There was a meeting that they had at the land's office that didn't turn out well.
For at least 2 decades, the Kunde family rented and farmed a majority of 26 quarters of the First Nations land just north of Stockholm. Ochapowace says rent payment has been behind for 3 years, and after numerous attempts to get it paid, Ochapowace decided to end their relationship.
They didn't clear up the rent, so we issued them an eviction notice.
Ochapowace issued an eviction notice in April, and the family had 2 weeks to remove their equipment from the property. Kenneth and other staff then issued another notice in person to Owen Kunde, who was still removing crop from the land. He says as they drove away, they saw a rifle in its case with the barrel visible in the front seat of Kunde's truck. They then called RCMP.
We were told it was for shooting gophers, but we didn't know what it was. We didn't want to assume what it was. And like I said, for me, I just told my staff to vacate the area.
Ochapowace staff say Esterhazy RCMP did not answer the call until days later. RCMP say the incident was determined to be a civil matter, but upon review say not all investigational steps were followed by Esterhazy RCMP. Adding in a statement, we provided guidance to all of our officers in an effort to prevent this from happening in the future.
Where is the RCMP, when we need them the most, and as our protectors, they are to be here, to assist us.
CTV News contacted the Kunde family and they declined the comment. Kenneth Bear says the First Nation is now renting out the land to another family. Meanwhile, the FSIN says it will continue to call on the RCMP to review the issue of enforcement of First Nation law on reserve. Creason Ashkate, CTV News, Ochapowace First Nation.
The Yellowhead Institute is taking a look at which parties' platforms are best for land rights. We'll speak with Hayden King after the break.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamourand, and here's what's coming up on Nation to Nation. We convene a panel of political experts to express their opinions on Monday's election, especially over the question, does Trudeau deserve 4 more years based on his Indigenous record? As well, Muchalna political scientist Eli Enns weighs in on the campaign's environment and climate change debate. Again, did the Liberal government do enough? And what did the other parties offer? And we hear from Mark Charles. He's a Navajo man running to be President of the United States of America. That's all coming up right after the national news.
Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. Showers and 15 for Halifax and St. John's. Rain in Nain with a mix of snow and a high of +4. 7 and rain in Cartwright. Partly cloudy and 11 for Montreal and Quebec City. Showers and 9 for Saguenay. A sunny day in Toronto with a high of 12. Showers and 13 for Ottawa. Partly cloudy and 11 for Thunder Bay. 5 above with cloudy skies in Sioux Lookout. A rain-snow mix for Churchill with a high of +3. +7 for the Pas. 8 above in Winnipeg, Brandon and Gimli. +9 for Dauphin. 15 is the high for Regina and Estevan. 18 in Swift Current. +6 and showers for Uranium City and Stony Rapids. Welcome back. Big promises were made to Indigenous peoples ahead of the 2015 federal election. This time around, pipelines and climate change are at the fore, and Liberal support appears to have plummeted. But what about land rights? That's the question our next guest addresses in his latest article for the Yellowhead Institute, titled Election 2019, Which Party Will Return the Land? Hayden King is the Indigenous think tank's executive director. He joins us from Ryerson University in Toronto. Hayden, thanks for joining us. In your brief, you ask, quote, are any of the parties planning to give land back, end quote. Can you elaborate on that question and tell us what you found in the parties' costed platforms?
Sure. Well, I'm the executive director at Yellowhead Institute, and the next piece of research that we're putting out is called the Red Paper Land Back, and we're looking specifically at how Canada dispossesses Native people of land and how Native people are trying to get it back. And so I thought it was important, preceding that research, to look at some of the party commitments this election and moving forward to see if there's any elements of land restitution in those costed campaign commitments. And regrettably, it does not appear to be the case. There are obviously a lot of rhetoric around supporting concepts like free, prior, and informed consent, but when it comes to investments in new frameworks to treat First Nations and Indigenous communities generally with integrity and respect around land issues, there is really no substance.
In the piece, you also evaluate the party's commitments on things like drinking water, language, housing, the MMIWG's inquiries, calls for justice, and climate action. How do these issues relate back to land rights?
Well, yeah, I think that by far the most commitments you see on broader Indigenous issues comes from the new Democratic Party. They have by far the most resources committed, at least in the first year, than actually all the other parties combined, to breathing life into the recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, or housing, clean water, treatment center for Grassy Narrows. The Liberals have just $25 billion committed to investment, $25 million committed to infrastructure, and likewise with the Conservatives, very low amounts committed to Indigenous issues generally. But of course, as we know, land rights underline a lot of the challenges that Indigenous people face, or being dispossessed from the land. We can trace almost every socioeconomic indicator to that dispossession, and so these are all interconnected issues and really inseparable from each other. And so addressing them in silos doesn't really lead us down the path that I think a lot of Indigenous communities are trying to get to.
An Environics poll commissioned by APTN found Liberal support down among Indigenous voters, while Conservative support is up from the Harper era. Yet you write that the NDP is the party promising the most to Indigenous peoples this election. How important is it, do you think, for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis folks to vote on Election Day?
I'm not one to say that people should vote or not vote. I think that, you know, going back 10 years, we've had this argument that voting can be a form of harm reduction. We can help select the next party that's going to form government that may work with Indigenous people in collaboration, but more often than not, we see that those parties break their commitments and don't fulfill on obligations, whether they're treaty obligations or otherwise. And so I think that we should use all tools necessary to try to influence Canadian politics, and voting is one of those tools. But by no means would I say that it's the end of political engagement for Indigenous people.
Well, Hayden, really looking forward to the red paper on land back, and appreciate you taking some time for us here today.
Yeah, absolutely.
A new episode of APTN Investigates debuts tomorrow night. We've got a preview for you after the break. Here's a look at the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. Sunny and 12 for Peace River and Fort McMurray. 18 above under sunny skies for Medicine Hat. 15 in Lethbridge and Red Deer. To the west coast, showers and 12 for Victoria, Vancouver, Tofino, and Campbell River. Snow and +4 for Fort Nelson. 6 and showers in Dease Lake. -6 for Old Crow. -4 in Rock River with snow. +1 with snow for Fort Liard, Trout Lake, Fort Simpson, Wrigley. -2 and sunny for Sax Harbor. 4 below and sunny skies for Paulatuck. 0 for Chesterfield. Snow and +1 in Arviette. -9 in Resolute and Arctic Bay. Welcome back. Coming up on APTN Investigates tomorrow night, part 2 of Healing Housing. Reporter Christopher Reed heads to a tiny community inside the Arctic Circle where overcrowding is rampant and renovations badly needed. Here's a preview.
While housing problems exist across Turtle Island, households in Canada's north are bursting at the seams and falling apart.
I'll show you my door. It's not fixed well. You can see the interior is coming off. And you can see a big crack on my floor. And it can move. When the house gets warm, the smell comes out here.
It's a reality that Josh Alahut lives with every day. He lives here in Hall Beach, Nunavut, with his 4 young children and spouse, Leslina. The tiny Inuit hamlet just inside the Arctic Circle has a big problem. Housing, or a serious lack of it. And what is built here for the more than 400 residents badly needs repair.
If you go to the washroom, you can see my counter of my washroom. It can move, and my cupboard has been broken for about 4 years now.
And you can watch the entire episode tomorrow night, right after the national news. That's your APTN National News for this Thursday. For news anytime, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. Now, stick around. Nation to Nation with Todd Lamarand is up next. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great night.